Alright guys, how's it going? Over this past month or so, past 6 or 7 weeks, I've had access to a GTX 1080 Founders Edition and also a GTX 980 Ti. That's why you saw them in the benchmarks of my RX 480 review and also when I did the retest of Doom using the Vulkan API. It was pretty interesting to see just how much that large gap in Doom came down when the Vulkan patch came out. But that wasn't what I borrowed the cards for. The reason I borrowed the cards was after my Nvidia GTX 1080 and GTX 1070 Maxwell on speed video, one or two people didn't really like that comparison. I'm not entirely sure why this is such a big thing, but it's almost like we want to believe that these companies are putting more effort into their architectures than what they actually are. For me it looked pretty clear cut though. Sure, there will always be new stuff in a new architecture. For example, simultaneous multi-projection here, which is very nice for VR. And there were one or two other changes in the Pascal architecture as well. But what I really meant with my Maxwell on speed comment, I was talking about the shader performance, the shader throughput, all those CUDA cores. Were they really any different from what we had seen already with Maxwell? There seemed to be an obvious way to check, and that means testing out the cards at similar clock speeds, and more importantly, at the same teraflops. And that is what I'm going to do in this video. Now you may think, well this should be pretty easy. All you have to do is use a program like MSI Afterburner and lower the clock speed down to the 980 Ti's clocks. There was an issue though, because all of the software that I used would only allow a drop of 200 MHz on the core of the GTX 1080. Now, the GTX 1080 frequently boosts above 2 GHz in gaming, which meant that in many cases I could only drop the core clock to a minimum of around 1580 or so megahertz, which wasn't enough because 980 Ti's generally reach around 1400 megahertz when overclocked. So this left me with a bit of a dilemma. How exactly do I get the clock speeds down to around 1200 MHz? The program I ended up using was ASUS's GPU Tweak utility. This allowed me to drop the clock speeds by 200, but more importantly, the power target could be set to 50%. Now, if you set a power target of 50% for a graphics card, there's no way it's going to be able to boost anywhere near its maximum boost speed. You can also do this in Afterburner, but I found that the ASUS GPU Tweak utility let me do what I really wanted to do, and I was able to drop the GTX 1080's clock speed down to 1080 MHz, which is pretty apt. The problem then, however, was the boost clock. As you can see here, using MSI's Afterburner on-screen display, the GPU one, that is the GTX 1080, is still clearly boosting, so that made it really hard to get the actual average over the benchmark run. What this meant was I had to create a log of the GPU's clock speeds over the 30 to 40 second duration of the benchmark. This is something that MSI Afterburner can do. You can log the history to a file. However, I just wanted the raw data and Afterburner records it in a slightly different way, so that was no good. So what I finally decided on was Tech Power-Up's GPU Z. Now you can see here that I'm back on the RX 480, but what I did with the GTX 1080 was click on the Sensors tab and you see all of these sensors which can be logged to file. Because I was only interested in the GPU core clock, I simply clicked on this down arrow, click on Enable, and do this for the rest of the data that I didn't care to log. So now if I click on Log to File, this allows me to save the GPU core clock to a file for the duration of the run. However, if we take a look at the file, for example, under clock run 1, running Doom OpenGL, we can see that the data saved includes the date and time as well as the GPU core clock. Looking at the time, we can see that it updates every second, but we're really only interested in the GPU core clock in megahertz information. So what I need to do is run this in a spreadsheet. And once we get the data into the spreadsheet, it's a simple case of auto sum the total and divide it by 30. 30 of course being the length in seconds of the benchmark. So that left me with 1227 megahertz for that benchmark run. I then had to do that with every single run that I did, every benchmark, to get the average clock speed. All of the data from all of the runs in the 4 games that I tested was then put into another spreadsheet so I could create the charts. So now, for example, in a game like Tomb Raider, I had the average clock speeds from 3 runs of 1265 MHz. So now I had to overclock the GTX 980 Ti up to 1265 MHz in order to get a clock versus clock comparison. So let's first of all take a look at the cards as they come out the box with their factory clocks. In this case, the average of the GTX 1080 over the 4 titles was 1789 MHz. The 980 Ti is an aftermarket MSI with a factory overclock of 1215 MHz. Over the 4 games, the GTX 1080 was around 22% faster than the MSI 980 Ti. Now the average of the GTX 1080's runs when underclocked was 1287 MHz. As you saw, this did vary game to game, and in fact had a much higher boost clock in Fallout 4 compared to the other games. What is of course interesting is the way in which the MSI 980 Ti, at the same clock speeds, now has a small but clear lead of 7%. Those of you that know your graphics cards well, however, will also know that this is not really a fair test, because while the GTX 1080 has 2560 CUDA cores, the 980 Ti has 2816. So if we really want to compare the cards on a true equal footing, we need to reduce the 980 Ti's clock speeds to the level at which the teraflops are the same as the GTX 1080s. Now, I had hoped to show you each game in a head-to-head, but very early on it became clear that there was an issue. On the left we can see the GTX 1080 and on the right is the 980 Ti. And even with the equalised teraflops, it was clear that the 980 Ti was performing much better, which is something that I simply did not expect. After checking the FLOPS logs of the runs, it was clear that the recorded video FPS was not the same as the benchmark FPS in FLOPS. This could only really mean one thing, and that was that Shadowplay, which is what I was using to record, was suffering more of a performance impact on the 1080 compared to the 980 Ti. So this is something I'm going to have to think a little bit more about in future. Equalising the flops for the 980 Ti was actually very simple. You simply multiply 2560, which is the number of CUDA cores on the 1080, by 2, and then multiply the average of the underclocked runs, which in the case of Tomb Raider was 1265, so 1.265 in gigahertz, for the total of 6.477 teraflops. Again, we know that the 980 Ti has 2816 shaders. Multiply that by 2, store the value in memory, and if we now simply divide 6477 by that number, we can see that we need a 1.15 GHz clock speed on the 980 Ti in order to equalise the flops with the 1080. And as you can see, I have done this with every game. And here we have the final results, which for me vindicates my position that Pascal is mostly Maxwell on speed. Over the 4 games, with an average clock speed of 1287 MHz on the GTX 1080 compared to an average clock speed of 1170 MHz on the 980 Ti, with identical teraflop values, there was less than a 1% difference in the results between the 2 cards, which is basically margin of error stuff. Now, of course, there are 1 or 2 other aspects of the cards which are not identical. For example, the 1080 has better memory compression, even though it has a tiny bit less bandwidth. In reality, it has more bandwidth available to it because of the compression. And there are slight differences in things like ROPS. These are not really making a big difference though. On average, at identical flops, these cards have identical performance. Right, so that's all well and good and interesting from an academic perspective, but what does it actually mean? Having thought some more about this, it actually does mean an awful lot. The simple fact of the matter is, Nvidia struck gold with their Maxwell architecture, and they knew they had struck gold. If you remember back a couple of years ago, there was no such thing as Pascal on their roadmap. The roadmap went Kepler, Maxwell to Volta, with later roadmaps showing Pascal in between Maxwell and Volta, and that is of course what we ended up with. This was a simple choice for Nvidia. They already had the architecture with Maxwell. It was on 28 nanometers and they had a massive efficiency lead. The simple thing to do was just shrink Maxwell and get the benefit from moving to 16 nanometer FinFET. And that's pretty much what they have done, at least for their consumer GeForce cards. It does however make you wonder what Volta will be like. I can't imagine Nvidia wanting to change away from this because it is such an efficient architecture. So that one remains to be seen. Things are pretty interesting from AMD's perspective. They were talking about improved shader efficiency in Polaris of up to 15%. While I don't have an R9 390 or an R9 290 in order to test this, I do believe that Computerbase tested it and found that it was more like 20% plus higher performance per shader between AMD's Polaris and their previous generation Hawaii architectures. So AMD has made improvements elsewhere in their architecture, while Nvidia basically massively increased their clock speeds again with Pascal. Both companies obviously have their own thing. AMD has HBM, which we will see with Vega. We won't see HBM on GeForce cards until Volta. From AMD's perspective, obviously the HBM is going to help a lot. The same as it helped with Fury, and cards like the Fury Nano, which were basically on par with Maxwell due to the HBM. This is going to help with Vega, but in the end, Nvidia's magic transistors, which are some of the most efficient I have ever seen. This is a big issue for AMD. They've got a real issue here when Nvidia can clock 50% higher while using slightly less energy. This is a big thing. It's all well and good having all these nice architectural things. HBM, absolutely brilliant, but Nvidia's gonna have that next year. And the same with asynchronous compute. These are things that Nvidia will improve on with Volta. In order to bring this back to parity, AMD needs to figure out what it was that Nvidia did with Maxwell back in early 2013 when they first released the 750 Ti. If we assume that AMD has gone and reverse engineered that card, which they should have done, then there may be a chance of Vega reaching the sort of clock speeds that it needs to reach. If 1400 MHz is the best Vega can do, then I simply cannot see any way of them catching Pascal with its blazing fast, efficient clock speeds. Brute force really still counts, especially in terms of having a base to build on. So this is what we really need for AMD. As far as Nvidia goes, I simply would not change this when it is clearly a winning formula. There are of course other differences as well. Nvidia's Pascal is manufactured at TSMC, whereas AMD's Polaris is manufactured at Global Foundries. There are differences in the process, so perhaps if Vega is also manufactured at TSMC, this may help AMD to increase the clock speeds. Again, hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about this in the upcoming months, and these are things that I will talk about in future videos as well. I've been doing an awful lot on graphics cards recently, so I'm going to start having a look at other things too. So be on the lookout for 1 or 2 different videos coming soon. I'll catch you later, guys.